Morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of day 2 of the Nuffield Trust Health Policy Summit. This first session is about solving the workforce burnout crisis. My name's David Oliver. I've been an NHS consultant for 25 years now, worked in the NHS since the late 80s, and I've been looking after COVID wards all the way through the pandemic. In fact, when I was here in 2020, it was right on the cusp of the pandemic, and I looked after the first person to die a week later. And if those of you who are here, you'll remember a lot of kind of nothing to see here playing down the scale of the crisis. So it's been quite a roller coaster. But when we talk about burnout, it was there, and moral distress was there, and a workforce crisis before the pandemic. The pandemic has just proved an accelerant. On a panel with me, I've got Professor Alison Leary, who's the Chair of Healthcare and Workforce Modelling at London South Bank University. Professor Kevin Fong, consultant anaesthetist at University College London. The format will be that Kevin and Alison are going to spend 5 or 6 minutes setting out some initial thoughts about burnout and potential solutions. I'll probably come back with a couple of questions just to prompt things. Then we've got a generous time allocation till 10:10 to go out to the floor, and also hopefully to get some questions from the online community. Our hashtag, and we encourage people to post, is hashtag NT Summit. We're live streaming, and anyone who wants to watch on catch up, you can see the 2020 conference still on the website now, so it will be available for people to watch in due course. Burnout, compassion, fatigue, moral distress have been well described, as I say, before the COVID pandemic, and have a clear impact on safety, quality of patient care, staff retention and morale. And if you look at the current serious performance and staffing gaps in the NHS, which are reflected in public satisfaction, look at the Health Foundation Ipsos Mori survey last week, the general public are as concerned about morale and retention and staffing as the staff themselves. And I would not underestimate the importance of us as frontline clinical staff going in every day to work in COVID-heavy environments. Scottish analysis showed we were 7 times more likely to contract COVID than members of the general public. I've had 7 or 8 friends in medicine who sadly died. I've had plenty more people who've been hospitalised and plenty more who've suffered from long COVID. But also the scenes we witnessed, especially in the first and second wave, were pretty harrowing and distressing and not to be repeated. And especially for early career doctors, where that's their first experience of medicine was being in that milieu, it's something I'll never forget. The Health Safety Investigation Branch report last week, looking at stress in urgent and emergency care, warned of the potential impact that staff stress and burnout could have on patient safety. And they said investigators interviewed staff across urgent and emergency services, including nurses, about the emotional impacts of their work. The report said many staff cried or displayed other extreme emotions while describing their working environment, the difficult decisions they're forced to make in relation to patient care, and the burden of moral distress. And certainly when I found myself watching This England, which I mustn't confuse with This Is England, although I wonder sometimes, that was quite triggering for me, watching some of what went on, what was depicted during the pandemic. And I think some of what's going on now with the industrial relations disputes with ambulance, physio, nurses, junior doctors, yes, it's about terms and conditions, but I think some of it reflects concerns about work-life balance, unmanageable workload, staffing gaps in a country that has among the fewest doctors and nurses per 1,000 in the OECD. I've got my own personal experience of this, having never really been off work sick myself. I got so burnt out after 2.5 years of COVID medicine that I had to resign from being the RCP president that I'd just been elected to, and then I had to have 5 months off work and a phased return to work. And when I came back to work, the colleague I share the ward with was also in similar straits. So it has a lot of resonance for me, and I'm back in one piece now. I'm going to just show you 2 quick slides to illustrate the scale of the problem. I'm hoping this works. So this is from the Nuffield Trust pulling together the annual NHS staff survey. So you can see the questions there. Percentage of people feeling unwell, looking forward to going to work, being enthusiastic about their job, satisfied with the extent to which my organisation values my work. I would recommend my organisation as a place to work. And then I often think about leaving the organisation. And you can see on all of those metrics, things are worsening. And I commend to you a really good report from the Institute for Government by Hodinot recently about the NHS crisis, Do We Have a Solution?, which is full of interesting graphs. And this one I just picked out, change in available staff days lost due to mental health from March 2016 to August 2022. And I think that paints quite a stark picture, doesn't it, of where we are at the moment, with people being so burnt out that their mental health is being affected and they're taking more sick days. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Kevin, and then to Alison, and we'll come back out to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So I'm Kevin Fong. Despite the Aston, I'm sort of speaking here in my role as Chair of Public Engagement and Innovation at University College London. I've got a very checkered career, but I'll explain it a little bit because it's relevant to what I'm going to say. So I started out life enjoying education so much that I did some of my A-levels twice, and then applied to go and study astrophysics at university because the University College Applications Handbook is alphabetically arranged. I had always wanted to be a doctor, but I thought it was very difficult to be a doctor. You had to be very clever. But my second year of physics, I lived with medical students, and one night we came home and I took a long, hard look at them drooling on each other, and I thought, how hard can it possibly be? So I stumbled around and did a lot of different things. I worked for NASA for a while with Medical Operations Group, and that's relevant because when I sat in their coffee rooms, they had the same conversations that we have in the NHS, that there's something that we do at this front line where science, risk and technology coincide, and risk to human life is also part of that the people upstairs don't truly understand us, and that if we continue like this, something bad is going to happen. And I always thought that if two such disparate organisations can be having the same conversation, there must be a general theory of risky business. So that's what I do. I go around, stumble around from different organisations, trying to look at them and learn lessons and bring them back. As my best friend said, you know, a bit like Forrest Gump, really. Today's story is really, for me, is about burnout and well-being, but well-being more so for me. During COVID, I worked with NHS England, really just in a very peripheral role, helping to understand the structure of the response there and pitching in what I could. There was a point in the response where I realised people were saying the staff are very tired, but I'd been working in the units and I did my time in the ad hoc units at UCH and going into other hospitals, and I knew they were more than tired, and I thought they were injured. But no one really was capturing that in any objective way, so I did two bits of work. One was a survey over about 6 different time points. Across those time points, there were about 11,000 respondents of intensive care teams, not because they were the only people affected and not because they're the most important, but because to do that sort of survey, you have to have good engagement with that workforce. And I had to walk those surveys into those units and get them to complete. Everyone knows that the situation is bad. We ran those surveys, we've published this work, it's in the public domain. At the peak of the pandemic, using standardized tools, the prevalence of any common mental disorder, so depression, anxiety, harmful use of alcohol, or probable post-traumatic stress, was north of 50% in my responding participants. Of note, amongst all of that, so although those numbers were screamingly high, of note, at the peak of the 2021 pandemic, the rate of probable post-traumatic stress using a standardized tool, the PCL6, was 46.5% across all the staff, and higher still in nurses, north of 50%. Now, you're probably not used to hearing those numbers, so I'll tell you, in the 2016 survey, the prevalence of any common mental disorder in the general population, that's 16.16%. The prevalence of post-traumatic stress is between 3 and 4%. So we're looking at north of 50% for any common mental disorder and a mental health disorder, and 46.5% for probable post-traumatic stress at the peak in 2021. The highest recorded rate of probable post-traumatic stress in the literature before we published our survey was in British military veterans deployed in a combat role in Afghanistan, and that number was 17. Now, it's difficult to translate between the populations, but it is safe to say academically that the rates of post-traumatic stress we see in our healthcare staff in the wake of COVID are comparable to those seen in military veterans who fought in Afghanistan in a combat role. Why has this happened? Well, the well-being problem predated the pandemic. It's obvious that it did. Like so many things, the pandemic just accelerated and deepened pre-existing problems. The response to the pandemic was for us to set up a vast amount of infrastructure in a very short period of time, which I personally think was quite successful. The problem is that you get to the end of that rope and there's still a gap between supply and demand, as there always is in the health service somewhere. And the only operational strategy for us over time immemorial has been to stretch the staff into the gap between supply and demand. Only it's usually that, and during COVID it was there. The problem and the lie we tell ourselves organisationally is that can have no cost. Of course it has cost, and the cost is borne by the staff. I've read you those numbers. We've done a recovery survey, and we haven't seen our rates settle of post-traumatic stress much below about 1 in 3, about 28-30%. We've heard from Nigel yesterday in his opening address about acknowledging the fact that the NHS is a complex system. I would deepen that. I've learned from others in this room. I think Mary Dixon-Woods is here. You know, it's a complex adaptive system with all the properties that go with a complex adaptive system, and it is socio-technical. And I'm pleased to hear so often us talk about workforce at this conference, because so often we talk about the technical aspects of the NHS, how we're going to deliver things and what care groups and what ICBs. Those are all the technical, those are all the structures. There is a social component. Those are the people that work for the NHS. They are its most expensive part, and we almost always ignore their needs. And that is why I think we are here. Where are we now? The NHS needs more money, it needs more people, and it needs more safety and more quality of care. But guess what? You can get that. You just need to invest in your workforce. I was that person who thought well-being was important, but I didn't really need it myself, and it probably wasn't central to the operational strategy of the NHS. I've changed my mind about that. I think I probably got through COVID unscathed, but I know that many of my colleagues didn't. I think it's clear from the data that my colleagues are injured in substantial fraction and significantly. I think that they have not recovered. We know from the data that if you see those rates of injury in any workforce, it impacts their functional status. Part of the study we published used the Work and Social Adjustment Scale, which shows the level of impairment that is associated with your mental health status. We found around 1 in 3 staff reporting the impairment in the performance of their professional duties because of their state of mental health. This is an enduring problem. The NHS survey, staff survey last year, March 22, shows that 47%, nearly half of all of the 686,000 people who filled that in, say that they felt sick because of work-related stress in the last 12 months. If you don't think that's evidence enough of an enduring problem, look at the industrial action, look at the leaving rates, which Nuffield published a report upon last year. In the year to June 2022, more staff left the service than have ever done in the history since records began. Fully 1 in 9 of every nurse that works for the service left the service between January and June 2022. My understanding is the latest data show that that trend continues. What do? So you can't solve this instantly in one blow. It is many small things at the same time, but you can start small, and those small things can make a difference. What do we all know as people in the room who try and manage and understand how to improve services? We know that we do not manage what we do not measure, and we haven't managed the mental health of our workforce in any useful longitudinal way that is operationally valuable to the people who manage those workforce from day to day. I'm an anaesthetist, I do some intensive care, I work on one of the pre-hospital air ambulances. When I turn up for work on the air ambulance, we spend about half an hour checking the aircraft, checking the kit. I have a suction machine. I turn it on, I check it can achieve the right suction power. Why? Because I want to know that when I'm in a tight spot, that bit of kit, when I flick it on, is going to work properly. We are very familiar with making checks on the material infrastructure around us. Somehow we do not make those checks of ourselves. It's not in our culture. We should do it. It's the least we can do. When we start measuring, we will start managing. Wellbeing needs to be a strategic priority, and that needs to be more than just something we say. It needs to be more than just this isolated bit of our organisation into which we sweep the governance risk. It needs to be wired through our operational tiers from top to bottom, and every change that we make, we shouldn't just be thinking about the performance advantage it gets us. We need to think about what impact that will have on the staff for that performance advantage. We have not done that. We never do. We need to see this as investment and not expenditure. It is investment. If you do it properly, you will see that money again. We've published a report with the International Public Policy Observatory that was a fairly coarse but formal economic analysis that showed that if you could erode retention issues by a very small amount, by 3 to 5%, you could save the NHS billions per year. It's obvious. Most of our expenditure is our staff. The best way to make sure there are more staff on the shop floor this winter is to stop them leaving at the rate that they're leaving at the moment. The final things are that we need to get away from this culture of the false dichotomy between the staff and the patients. We're all guilty of it. We all say, and I've heard it said at this conference, why are we all here? There's a patient there. And there's this idea that there's the staff and the patient, and you have to choose in a resource-limited environment whether you invest in one or the other. But the truth is that that's not a sustainable solution. We are reaping that in full right now. The needs of the patient and the needs of the staff are aligned fully. If you cannot look after your staff if you do not you cannot look after your patients if you do not look after your staff. This is what we are being told by the workforce at volume right now. We need to get past that. And the workforce need to get past that. They need to get past the idea of self-sacrifice as a virtue and see it as an unsustainable model of working for the future. Well-being is not nice to have. Well-being makes your health service cheaper to run. It makes it safer to run. It makes it better in quality. You don't need to take my studies for that. When you start looking, it is there all the way back. You realise this story has been told over and over again, and no one has ever chosen to do anything about it. And now it's very difficult, but it doesn't mean we can't do anything. I'm going to finish with one last thing. And I think that workforce is the biggest challenge that we face going forwards in the NHS. I think anyone who doesn't understand that cannot fix the workforce. The NHS is the people who work for it. It is a labour-intensive organisation. If we do not look after them, they cannot look after other people. It's abundantly clear. Fully one in 4 nurses who works for the NHS leaves in the first 3 years of service. We are not getting this right. In coupling with the surveys, I did about 50 visits into hospitals during the hot phases of COVID. I organised over 50. I went on about 42 myself. It was pretty sobering. Most days I was in front of a team. I spent all day with them. Most of them were crying. Some days it wasn't just them that was crying. It was pretty bad. I went into one unit up in the north, and they said to me pointedly, you're from down in London. What's your plan to recover the workforce? And I said, it's complicated, isn't it? I'm not sure how we're going to recover after the pandemic. And she said, pointedly, you're all very clever people down there. I'm sure you can get in the room and work out a plan to recover us. And then she said, the thing that I will always remember, she said, if you do not come up with a plan to rest and recover the workforce will rest themselves. That is what you are seeing right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. So I am a mathematician and a registered nurse, and a lot of what Kevin says I'm probably going to cover in just a bit more detail. The issue, I think, for me, is that although I am a mathematical modeller, workforce is actually a social science, and that isn't really accepted in the NHS. So I work across a number of safety critical industries and other industries like retail grocery, retail pharmacy, utilities. And their view of workforce is very different to the NHS. The way they design their workforce is very different to the NHS. We do a lot of cross-sectional surveys, a lot of pulse surveys, And through that data, I've pulled out around 45,000 people and mined the text to see what they meant by burnout. So one of the ways that people leave is retiring. But when you dig down beneath that data, that retirement category in the ESR, you see lots of other things. And these are some of them. So exhaustion is a word people use frequently. They also cite a lack of flexibility. So Jane Dacre yesterday pointed out very rightly that the NHS is a largely female workforce, so is social care. And yet very little meaningful effort is made around flexibility. And we published a paper, I think it was in 2019, that showed if you were a nurse and you wanted to work part-time, you not only dropped your hours, you dropped your pay grade, you dropped your banding under AFC. And that's worse if you work in general practice where there is no AFC. So there's also a thing about value. And when we think about workforce, we think about respect, reward and recognition. And reward is one of those issues. In the pulse surveys that we do, what we see is a workforce that has a higher intention to leave. I've been doing this for about 15 years. We usually see intention to leave around 20%, and about 5 or 6% actually do go. In May 2021, our large-scale surveys jumped to 60% intention to leave, and it's stayed that high. That's 60, which is quite a big increase, and now we're seeing that come through in the data. So there is something that needs to be done around this. But there are other issues. So the valuing of work seems to be less. People perceive their work is valued less now. And also, things like the infrastructure make them work harder, make them duplicate work. There's also been, in response, I think, probably to the pressures, a taskification of work. So work is now a series of tasks, and that doesn't sit well with people's social identity. So we've got a number of challenges. The big one for me is that we work on a supply-side model for workforce. So instead of thinking about demand and how much labour we actually need, and I'm talking about different types of labour, so not just physical labour and technical labour, but also emotional labour, organisational labour, and cognitive labour, as we would think of that in any other safety-critical industry, we use activity as a proxy for our workforce modelling. And activity doesn't reflect the demand for labour. So we end up with the deficit that Kevin described. And that's quite a serious issue, because then there is a kind of social convention that people will work for free and they would donate their labour for free. And people are now becoming more resistant to that, I think. So one of the other issues is gap filling. As parts of the workforce have disappeared, we see others having to fill the gap. Now, this could be district nurses having to fill in for other district nurses, but one of the really big areas that we see when we do workforce work intensification is that the denuding of administrative staff has then pushed that work onto clinical staff. And quite often it's replicated work, so people having to do the same thing twice. Technology is also one of the issues where it's not really meeting the needs of the workforce. So people having to duplicate work, filling in a form twice and then put it into a computer, that kind of thing. So there's quite a lot of things that are consuming labour. And an expectation that workers will fill in gaps. So when we think about workload intensification, this can be quite a stressful thing for people to experience. So I copied this tweet actually because it really summed up the gap filling issue of a nurse. You know, there's no wall clerk, the nurse will do it. There's no cleaner, the nurse will do it. And that is a constant issue that we hear about a lot of the time, particularly from frontline workers. So how do we address this? Well, good employment practices are really key. So pay is an issue. There is no getting away from pay. because pay is not only an issue around respect, reward and recognition, pay is a retention lever. Pay dictates pretty much your quality of life, the life that you can have. So if you are having to commute 2 hours after a 12.5-hour shift each way because you can't afford to live closer to work, that's going to have an effect on your quality of life. There's a lot around inequality, and we know that, but there's lots of different types of inequality in the workforce. And there are some attempts at addressing this, I think they're really helpful. But I think we need perhaps a cultural shift, a more humanistic approach to workforce. So many of those other industries would now have a more humanistic approach. They see their workforce as an asset, as human talent, rather than a resource to burn through. And I think in the NHS that still happens. There's always been a steady supply. And therefore, I think there's perhaps not been the kind of attention paid to the workforce that there should have been. Employee engagement is really important. And quite often, a lot of the people that tell us they're leaving because essentially something has been done to them. Working conditions have changed. Working practices have changed. And it's just kind of the final straw that actually makes them decide to leave. So understanding the demographic that we employ, it is a largely female workforce. Flexible working needs to be flexible. We need to take account of that demographic, and most other safety critical industries work hard at understanding the demographic of people that they employ. So most of these things are really important, but I think perhaps the most important thing is that should say workforce is never done. So it's a bit like painting the Forth Bridge. The workforce is human and organic. Everyone's really keen to see a workforce plan, which is great, and we do need a strategy. As they say at NASA, hope is not a plan. But essentially, workforce needs constant attention. And I think one of the things that we could really do to help the workforce is actually acknowledge this and start to employ more people like organisational psychologists, social scientists, human factor specialists, rather than just treating the workforce as a resource and a source of labour. Thank you.
Right, thanks to Alison and Kevin. I will come out to the audience in a moment, but a couple of thoughts. One is this whole business about resilience training. And there are timeless challenges of clinical practice that will always cause emotional, distress in any system, in any country, in any era. But giving resilience training for system problems and putting the responsibility onto individuals for, endemic staffing gaps and unmanageable workload isn't particularly helpful. The second thing is just about junior doctors, as I work with plenty of them, and I was one and I supervise them. If we can't get these things right for permanent staff who've been in the same organisation for years, what price a workforce that have to move often every year or every 2 years are constantly rotating and often don't feel that engaged or valued, so I can completely understand where some of their disquiet's coming from. But a couple of questions for you. One is, I'm struck when we have the staff satisfaction survey, and in fact the GMC survey of junior doctors, there are clearly high-performing organisations where morale is higher. And some of them are highly specialised, hospitals, for instance. But the first thing is there anything we can learn from the places that seem to do consistently well? What are they doing better than other places that goes beyond just having more staff and more resource? The kind of, the wins that aren't, because the single biggest factor that affects morale is staffing gaps and workload. But what can we learn from those places? And the other thing, in view of what Alison has spoken about care being reduced to a series of tasks, how can we restore that sense of professional autonomy in people who are trained graduate professionals and yet feel they've become task doers? And either of you can answer either of those questions, and then I'll go out to I've seen you, Claire.
Shall I take the task one?
Yeah.
So one of the really, really strong themes that we see is the loss of professional autonomy. And that causes dissatisfaction. So we see that manifest in different ways. So frontline skill dilution. So having to employ, to manage the workload, having to employ more and more perhaps less qualified, less experienced people. And this gives the healthcare professionals quite a lot of anxiety because now they're responsible for not only their work but other people's work. And also that that loss of continuity as well. In midwifery particularly, what we saw was the reason people came into midwifery was to be with women. And we saw their primary purpose, they felt, had been taken away. So a lot of their work was now delegated to maternity support workers that did a very good job, but then the midwives didn't feel that they were midwives anymore, and so they wanted to leave. So taskification, I think, is actually, it's got lots of consequences, and also we risk the very important joining up work that manages risk in healthcare. We're going to risk losing that experienced workforce that can teach that, and then what we will have is a technically competent workforce that cannot manage risk as well.
Okay.
I guess in terms of best practice, yes, of course, there are people who do better than others. I would say that it's a difficult field of competition for that. I think I would urge people to, in learning those lessons, the thing I've learned in my career is that you can't just learn them by having a casual chat with these people and then building a national policy. You have to embed with these teams, you have to understand why it works in that context, you have to understand what its relevance is to the context you want to translate it to. And all too often we take things that we think should work because they sounded good in a coffee room somewhere in some other part of the country, we turn it into national policy and then we drop it on the front line from 36,000 feet and we wonder why it's not intact when it hits. So yes, translate, but do the due diligence if you're going to translate.
Okay, so I'm going to come to Claire Girardeau, then Rebecca Rosen. And is there another hand up at the back? And the gentleman over there with the beard. We'll take those three and then come back. So Claire, first of all.
Yeah, thank you for brilliant talks, all three of you. So till recently, I've been running the NHS Practitioner Health Service, which is a mental health service for doctors, dentists, and now all NHS staff in England and Scotland. And to put things in context, at the beginning in 2008, we saw 400 new patients in that year, 208. We're now having 400 new patients present every week. And most of them, about half of those, have got suicidal thoughts within the last 2 weeks. Such serious distress, right across the board. It's not just ITU staff, GPs, junior doctors. And many of us have been banging on the drum of the workforce issue for years. I mean, I've been doing this for 17 years. But where you have a junior doctor who can't guarantee getting their wedding day off because it's in 18 months' time, we have a disgraceful service. Where you have GPs who are invariably scapegoats and saviours when all they want to be is good doctors, we've got a disgraceful service. And the NHS, for all its wonderful bits, is not a very good employer. We have we have national clinical directors in all sorts of things, in elderly care, in women's health, but not in the well-being of the workforce. We put it into various spaces. We've had mantra of, thank you, Kevin, for saying it, of, the patient at the centre. No, even Winnicott said you can't have a baby without a mother. And we've had the language, the abusive language that my profession is having on a daily basis, which we even hear here. The constant negativity, the lack of thanks. So thank you very much. My sense is, if we don't sort this, people are moving, they're walking into locum and peripatetic posts, they're moving out of healthcare, and that's just doctors, let alone the lower paid nursing staff, the other professional groups. So thank you. This is an urgent crisis that is facing us in clear sight.
Thanks, Claire. Rebecca? And then if you can take the mic just over there, yeah. Thanks.
Rebecca Rosen, GP and fellow at the Nuffield Trust, and thank you again for those excellent presentations. And I wanted to come back to Kevin's challenge about, is this a kind of tension between a patient and a staff perspective, and ask a question with my GP hat on, which is that at our last CQC inspection, we came out with good overall, but we were pulled up because when they audited our drug prescribing for, I forget if it was 2 or 4 patients. They hadn't had the necessary safety blood checks within 3 months. It was about 3.5 months, maybe 4. But we were pulled up on that. And that is emblematic of the kinds of workload burden associated with the safety culture that who would knock it. But what it does, it suffuses every bit of my work. So now I don't just whiz through blood tests and have a little alert out for unsafe drugs. It adds a burden of work and a stress. And I think if you look at, and there are loads of similar small things like that that add up in my working week. And so my question to you is this: if you look through a utilitarian lens, I'm not sure that the safety processes we've introduced and some of the stuff that has come out of the Francis inquiry, the culture of candour, the duty of candour, all those kinds of things which add layer upon layer upon layer of pressure. In the end, do they contribute more to the burnout side than the safety side? So a utilitarian lens is not the one that we're taking. We're tending to look at this through a very different moral lens. And I just wonder if it needs a kind of fundamental reflection, given the impact on workforce.
Okay, we'll just take one more and then, Yep.
Thank you. Simon Gregory, also a GP. There seems to be a theme here today. But I'm actually Medical Director of Primary Care for Health Education England, due to be Workforce Training and Education Directorate. Firstly, great to see you, Kevin, in person, because I've never met him 3D. We did so many Teams calls during COVID trying to step things up, so it's really great to be here in person. It's trouble if following people like Claire and Rebecca is I've got very little now to say, but I really want to pick up on resilience training. The reason we set up a commission looking into wellbeing and suicides was we were hearing of postgraduate doctors in training raising concerns about staffing levels, a bit like Appendix I, and being sent on resilience courses.
Yeah.
And it be a bit like Datix, that it's used as a stick with which to beat people that raise concerns. And we've really got to stop that, because you cannot meditate your way out of a toxic working environment.
That's it. And nor can you recruit your way out of a retention crisis.
No.
So just before I come to the panel, just to save a bit of time, so Sam Everington put his hand up over there, lady with the multicoloured scarf at the back there, and then I've got to pick somebody. Is that Theo over there, is it? So we'll come to you as well. No, I didn't call you Tara. Don't blame me for that. So if you can take the mics to them, and then we'll come back to Kevin and Alison.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I take the CQC?
Yeah.
Thank you for reminding me about the CQC issue. I think it's important. I think part of this is not that we've never done anything about well-being, but we've seen well-being as somehow separate from the delivery of services, that utilitarian approach to the delivery of care. It is socio-technical, and in that it is holistic. The people are as important as the structures that deliver, and somehow you almost never used to hear anything about the people. You always heard about the structures and the mechanisms. CQC I've done some work with, and they have been really extraordinarily receptive, I'm pleased to say. And this stemmed out of a point during the pandemic where CQC, in good intentions, went into a hospital that was in trouble. And that hospital had experienced a suicide in the trust. The days before the inspection, medical director went down to the unit that had experienced that, was talking to them about this loss that they experienced, and then medical director spotted someone with a wristwatch on and stopped the conversation, went over and said, listen, you can't do that. CQC are coming, you absolutely can't do that. And the point is that, yes, you shouldn't do that, but that is the power of regulation. If that's what you're inspecting, that's what you want is, when you know that the CQC are coming, you want your medical director around saying, are you all right? Have we got you the right things that you need? Are you all okay? Rather than just bare below the elbows. It's not enough. And so I think the regulators have an enormous lever here, and I was pleased to see Charlie Massey here today, and I'd like to continue those conversations with GMC as well, RCN as well have a role here. Because if we regulate it, if we make it a condition of good practice, then we get somewhere. That is the first lever, and it doesn't cost a lot. And CQC have been brilliant, actually, in coming into this space.
Alison?
Yeah, I mean, I can pick up the point about resilience, actually. I find it really interesting that, compared to other safety critical industries, the resilience of the system is right at the front door of the people that actually provide the service. Quite often, increasingly, we have a very high inexperienced workforce providing those services, and it doesn't focus on system resilience. So it's all about those people, and I see this quite a lot in employment tribunals. Actually, it's an individual that's quite often taking the hit for a systemic issue. So I think we need to focus a lot more on systemic issues, and I think to Rebecca's point actually about safety, I wouldn't say that was about safety. I would say that's about, you know, a regulatory tick box, and obviously checking bloods and things is safety, but this is about safety culture. We're still very much embedded in that safety is about harm, and it's not about safety and the prevention of safety culture, safety too. We're nowhere near that still.
And I mean, if you find yourself as a clinician in a coroner's inquest opposite the bereaved family or in a complaint resolution meeting, you're often being held accountable and having to apologise for stuff that's completely beyond your gift in terms of wait times or staffing or pressure on beds. And I think it would be very helpful to have, you know, standard kind of support from the board level about, you know, these were the prevailing circumstances.
Absolutely.
There aren't enough staff on the wards.
And just picking up on that, do you mind, David?
Yeah.
So one of the things I get a lot of messages about at the moment is this push model. So nurses working on wards that are having to board extra patients to alleviate the emergency department, and they already felt they weren't giving good care. And now they really feel they're not giving good care. And there have been some fairly catastrophic outcomes that people have shared with me. But their main issue is people aren't listening to their concerns. So they're suffering distress from the situation, but they're also suffering distress because people aren't listening to them.
Yeah. So we've got Sam, and then lady there, and then there was Thea, and then we'll try and get one more round. And if anybody's got some good examples of solutions in their local place of work, that'd be interesting as well. So,
Sam Everington, another GP. In 1989, I led the Junior Doctors' Hours campaign, and we were working an average of 84 hours a week. One of my jobs working for Wendy Savage was what we called a 1 in 2, 120 hours a week. And Firth Cousins from Sheffield, a psychologist, did a really interesting piece of research which showed, and I will never forget these figures, that 50% of junior doctors were emotionally disturbed, 28% had evidence of depression. I think nothing has changed, and if anything, things have got worse. There were good things then. You were part of a team, a firm. You weren't, like Bawagawa, actually taken the rap. Actually, the consultant took responsibility for my mistakes. My question to you on this one, and I've got two other points, is what's going on? What's going on with the junior doctors? Suppose it's less hours. What are those other things, Kevin, that you talked about that isn't about the money? I was stunned. I'm on BMA Council. I was stunned at 98% voting in favour of strike. That's not just about money. It's much, much deeper. The second thing is I published with some other people some research, about 8 or 9 years ago, about recruitment and retention of doctors. And there were two absolutely key features. And the first one was where you were born and brought up and where you trained. In other words, the connection, this isn't specifically about the workplaces, but it's connection to your support systems, your family and your community. So any comments you've got on that, I personally think that actually medical schools should be recruiting from their local areas. They should have a geographic responsibility, not a national responsibility. And I think this would massively help recruitment and retention. And finally, I've been involved in supporting Dr. Suresh's widow. He committed suicide. And he committed suicide after what I would call multiple jeopardy. And what you're talking about is multiple jeopardy all the time. It was the GMC, it was the hospital management, he was suspended, it was social services involved because he had children, it was the police. And we are now dealing with, some people talk about 22 regulators, a system that imposes multiple jeopardy on individuals, and that causes massive stress. So any thoughts you've got on that too?
Okay.
Alex at Queen's Nursing Institute, and also an associate of the Point of Care Foundation, which is set up to support staff in dealing with the reality of working in healthcare. I suppose what I'm thinking about is Mengis Lythe's work was done in the 1960s, so we have known a lot of this stuff for a long time. We also know from an anthropological point of view that in terms of shifts, you have to have ruptures in the sort of habitual ways of responding, of which the pandemic potentially is a rupture in our understanding of what goes on in healthcare. The language that we use to describe healthcare is often about service, but actually what we're doing is we are working with intensely emotionally difficult and inherently risky situations every day in the nature of our work, but it doesn't get talked about in that language. The anxiety that health professionals are feeling is also shared by managers, by regulators, by patients. And what Mengis Lythe's work said was it isn't just about the social defences that people put in place, which is around putting in regulation or checklists and all of that to help us manage the anxiety, is you have to create space for people to process these emotions. Given that I've been coaching doctors, nurses, whatever, for over 20 years, they process that in a private space. We have to acknowledge that all of us get affected by this. That's doctors, therapists, chief execs, because if we don't confront that and discuss the reality of what it is to work in it, we're never going to find some solutions. So there's an honesty that needs to come into the room about what is going on.
Thank you. Fair? Is there somebody else? Yeah, Fair, if you can, microphone over there. And then just before she asked the question, who else had the hand up earlier on? So I'll do my best to get everybody in, but there's a gentleman here with a checked jacket. There's Dame Jane Dacre over there, and there's a man with his hand up over there. So if you can take the mics to them in a minute. Yeah, carry on.
Thank you. I agree with what Sam said about the strikes not being just about money. We've had our nurses out on strike, and I joined our nurses on the picket line to talk to them during the first strikes. And what was very striking to me, was how many of them talked to me, obviously, about what I already knew, which was working conditions. Yeah. And the conversation I was having with my nursing staff was, I hope you win, I hope you get the pay deal that you want. It's not going to stop the fact that I don't have enough staff. And we're going to have to carry on the conversations we're having in my organisation about we do not have enough staff, how are we going to cope with that? So I think it's quite an interesting point, because I think the nurses will get a deal and we will still have the problems. And that's going to be really challenging for those of us leading organisations. Certainly we're starting that conversation. I wanted to reflect on something which I've been doing in my organisation. You talked about the fact that we have to understand that it's the staff that look after the patients. And I've been using the metaphor from flying on an aeroplane, the very simple one, you fix your own mask before you fix the masks of others, that we say on any aeroplane, you've got to look after yourself. What's been interesting, and I've reflected on this a lot, is the amount of anger I've had from staff, actually, when I've often talked about that. You don't understand, Thea, how hard it is for me to do that. You don't understand. I hope I am understanding and trying, and I'm also challenging back, but you have to have that break. You have to make that decision. There will still be that queue. That will still be that waiting list. But if you go down, it will be worse. But actually helping staff take a break, fix their own mask, is remarkably hard now because we're in such a difficult position. I wanted to reflect on that. The final thing I wanted to reflect on, two things, was taskification. Alison, you know, particularly in district nursing, this is a really significant issue. I would love to be able to move to, we talked about the Netherlands yesterday, to the Berkshire model. The Berkshire model has lots of things in it that can't read across, but one of the things it does have in it is the fact that those nurses are often able to do everything for an individual. They're able to bring people in. They're able to work at their top of their license, really. It's a very difficult thing to bring some of those elements into where we've got to here in this country, which I agree with. And finally, I've banned resilience training because I think we can't use it at the moment until we really understand and we are acknowledging the issues that are leading to the need for it. and I'd feel ashamed to send people on resilience training when we just don't have enough staff.
Okay, thanks. So it's three very rich, complex contributions. I know you can't deal with all of them, but Alison, do you want to come back on any of the 3 points that were made?
Yeah, there's so much there. I mean, but it just shows the diversity and the complexity, actually, of this issue. I think that the human aspects are vastly underestimated. So the issue around acknowledging, Rebecca Meyer's point about acknowledging the humanity. So we, people expend a huge amount of emotional and relational labour in healthcare. That isn't factored at all into any kind of demand or capacity modelling. You just have to fit that in. And to acknowledge that, I think, would be a really big step forward. So, people do acknowledge it's difficult, but what does that actually mean? So I think that would be a really, really positive step. I mean, along with very sort of simple workforce hygiene factors, being able to get a drink, not having to, so, the district nurses tell us that it's actually, because they're now, in some places treated like Amazon drivers, they've got these platforms that tell them where they've got to be in the next 2 minutes. They can't stop to get a drink. So that humanity needs to come back.
Kevin?
Gosh, there's so much to take on. There is a way of seeing this as opportunity rather than threat. So COVID is a perturbation in a system that unmasks property of the system that otherwise remained hidden until now. This is long in history. You hear Sam talking about work in the 60s, you hear work in the 80s here. It's awful when you look back at how much steeped history there is in the poor well-being of the staff. It's like watching a horror movie and realise it's been remade 4 times over the last 50 years and kind of no one ever changed the plot or the outcome. That's what this is. The thing about the mask and the aeroplane thing, yes, there is, and while I'm not a fan of putting the imposing upon the staff part of their own solution, but there is a culture that we have to come to where we do have to understand that is in the best interests of ourselves and our patients to look after ourselves optimally and to build that into workforce planning and structural planning of the service. Resilience training, absolutely agree. Now, there is a subtlety to that. I've done some work with Neil Greenberg. The papers we published were with him, who's a Prof of psychiatry at King's, also military psychiatrist formerly. And he talks about this concept that resilience doesn't lie within individuals, but between the members of your team. And that concept of it, I think, is useful. I think building conditions and working conditions in which you can optimally create the resilience that lies between the people so they can mutually co-support is important. And finally, the point that Sam brought up. So the past is a foreign country. We can't compare our experience in terms of the hours we worked and our expectations of life and society's expectations of us with the juniors today. We're not the only organisations that are facing this. Every single organisation in the room, whether you're a journalist or whatever you are, you know that your junior workforce has a different view of the world than you do. Deal with it and build your future. The successful companies of the future will be those that understand this and the ones that fail will be the ones that try and force them into some 1970s time trial.
Yeah.
The important final thing is the case, the tragic case of Dr. Bauer-Garber. Again, but it bears repeating. There are many failures of systems of care going on at the moment. We have to understand them in that context, in that lens. There's always a final narrative. There's always a final narrative that finds in the end that there was an individual, small group of individuals that were there at the moment at which the risk was realised and the failure occurred. But it is important to understand the complexity of that, of people operating under extreme circumstances, with extreme challenge, and that there is no single root cause, there is complexity, and that is the duty for us to tell those stories in that way, to stare into them, but to stare into the full complexity and not reduce them. Thank you.
Just to come back to what Sam said, I mean, I was a junior doctor in the same kind of era of 1 in 2, 1 in 3 rotas, brutal hours, and Kevin's right, there's no point harking back to how things used to be because of no relevance to modern generation. But I think the really important thing to me about what Sam said is that 30 years ago, we had the same issue with poor morale, poor mental health, stress, and our most valuable asset in the NHS is the frontline workforce, and we're still repeating those issues. You know, we've not invested enough in solving the problem, have we really, if people still have those experiences? We have time for one more round of questions. Did I already pick people? Yes, the gentleman there first of all, yeah.
Harry Sultan, Associate Non-Executive Director from West Yorkshire Integrated Care Board. So we've talked a lot about the current workforce, but I think we need a really big conversation about the future workforce. My other hat is I'm a med student as well, and I've been on placement, I've seen the morale of staff. They're burning out. It's not a good image to have as a med student. The state of the NHS I've been on placement, I've seen stretchers through corridors, and I'm stood there like, is the NHS an attractive place to work? Not really. Is there other industries that do want med students to work for them? Yes. In the last week, I've had 2 med student friends saying, I don't want to be a doctor anymore. And you know what, as someone who has future workforce in their remit as a non-exec, it is so disheartening to see that my own friends don't even want to work in the NHS. And I said why, and they were like, well, we're not wanted on placement. It doesn't look like a nice place to work, so what's the point? So we're losing staff at the top end, but by the end of uni, and even by the end of foundation years, students are burnt out. And how are we going to stop losing our future workforce before they've even started in the NHS?
Okay. Jane? And then there was a chap at the table at the back there. You have this hand up, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the panel, for the uncomfortable truths, and particularly to Alison. So Alison and I worked together recently on something that I chair for the Health and Social Care Committee, the expert panel, and it was brilliant to have Alison's maths brain working as well as her nursing brain, which was fantastic. We give CQC ratings to government pledges, and Rebecca, workforce, the government got inadequate. And we published that. We're not in the tower yet, are we, Alison? But we might be soon. But what I wanted to say is that Kevin talked about what measures gets done. You said it more articulately than that. And I know that Jeremy Hunt has snaffled through as part of the latest, what is it, financial state, the autumn statement, the need for there to be an independent evaluation of workforce numbers that were required. So my question to the panel is, if what gets measured, it gets done is true, we've got people like Alison who are really good at this measurement, will it make the difference that we need?
Okay.
Thanks very much. I'm Andy Bell from Centre for Mental Health, so this is my home topic. Thank you very much for having this session today. I wanted to try to offer some solutions and then a couple of questions. The first solution is we have to accept, prevalence-wise, that about 1/5 of the NHS workforce will experience a mental health difficulty every year, because that's the population prevalence. So we have to have systems and organisations that allow people to recover, to stay at work when they can, to have time off when they need it, and to come back and to feel that it's safe to disclose. That's first thing. The other thing is we often talk about mental health in workplaces, and the NHS can learn from other places. It doesn't have to be an island. We know about workplace risk and protective factors for mental health. There was allusion yesterday to the bullying culture in the NHS. We know that's toxic to mental health and well-being. We know about the importance of flexible working arrangements and fair practices. I think it's great today that we've not talked about interventions, but we know that what tends to happen is everyone agrees fundamentally with the importance of supporting staff mental health, and then when it comes back to it, we have the lifestyle drift of going back to interventions and doing things to people. Sometimes it's training, sometimes it's about outings and special things, but really looking at these structural factors is so important. So I guess my question is, how many people here who are on boards in the NHS know about the mental health and well-being of their staff routinely? Is it reported in the same way as patient safety, for example, is reported? Do you know what the mental health of your workforce looks like? Do you know what the risk and protective factors are? And what are you doing to tackle those risk factors? And then finally, I can't not say thank you to Kevin for the best hour of telly ever. on the shuttle programme. It was wonderful.
I know there's a question from online, but just before we do, in light of that, put your hands up if you are on the board of a provider organisation then. Not as many as you might think. And keep your hands up if you do have those data that were just raised, if you do have access to that information.
Can I ask a question, David?
Yes, of course you can, yeah.
So if you are on a board, do you use sickness data as safety data?
Variable.
Yeah.
Now,
So, and this is one of the issues, I think. So this is a really good point. We have workforce over here, we have safety over here, and we don't marry the two together, and they're absolutely intrinsic.
Yeah. What's the question from online then?
So this is a question from Krista Oldman, who's Chief Exec of the Q&I. She says, Nigel mentioned yesterday that we may have lost focus on the importance of management skills. Underlying much of the discussion is the importance of skilled line managers who know their staff, who provide a humanistic approach to their management and service, and can more appropriately support their staff in their work and well-being. Do the panel have a view on this?
Okay, so mindful of the time, both Kevin and Alison have said they're happy to answer questions offline, you know, after the session. But I want to give them a chance to come back to those 4 points and then just have some Jerry Springer-style final thoughts before we break for coffee. So, do you want to go first, Kevin?
Yes. I want to take on Jane's question about measurement. Measurement is the minimum that we can do. It's nearly free. I don't know why we don't do it. I've never understood it. You can't. If you measure, at least you'll know where you are and you'll know whether you're improving or getting worse. We don't know that. I think we deliberately don't. I have a great hatred of aviation analogies, as I think Mary Dixon Woods will tell you. I think I share that with her. But here's the thing. In World War I aviation, 46% of pilots died before they ever saw combat. They flew planes with no altimeter and no airspeed indicator. So the first time you knew you were going too fast is because when your wings fell off. And the first time you knew you were in the ground is because when you were in the ground. And the point is that analogy is where we are with workforce well-being. We have no altimeter. We have no airspeed indicator. We just pretend we know that it looks pretty dangerous right now. So measure it and use standardized tools. Use standardized tools so that they're interoperable and comparable from year to year, which is why we use the GAD-7, the PHQ-9, all that stuff that you as GPs use all the time. Why not use that? And do it more frequently, not just an annual staff survey at national scale. Do it at resolution with your own people. It's important, and we should do that now. And that gives something for the regulators to look at. Now, I want to say one final thing, which is the regulation needs some thought, because what you don't want to do is invent the league table of the worst well-being in the country versus the best. What you want to ask them is, what instrument, do you have an altimeter? Do you have an airspeed indicator? I don't care what it's saying, I trust you to know that you're monitoring it. But that's what you want to be asking. And so there's a subtlety to the way we use the regulators and the measurements in concert. That stuff doesn't cost much, and that stuff will allow us to say where we're headed. Thank you.
Alison?
I'd like to pick up on Jane's point as well. So I think one of the issues that we have is that demand and capacity modelling is the predominant model, and we, for some reason, we cannot move away from it. We cannot move to demand for labour modelling. So it always have that deficit. The thing about measuring as well, I quite often am involved in areas where something, a policy, technology, whatever has been deployed, and then the workforce leave sort of situation. And I always ask, did you do a workforce impact assessment for this big change? And no one ever does a workforce impact assessment of the thing that they've implemented. So everybody does need to read Mary Dixon Woods, I feel, about implementation. So absolutely. And actually the thing about the future workforce, so we know nursing student attrition is up to around 30% now. So students are dropping out, and they drop out for two reasons generally. One is finance, and the other is they see the workplace and they don't want to work there. And this is very, very radical. So the focus is always on more students, more students, more students. I think we should have less students temporarily, to give them a better workplace experience, and that's how we can have a sustainable, but that's a very unpopular opinion.
Yeah, but it's a good bombshell to finish on, isn't it? I was arguing on Twitter with someone who called himself Underground Gammon last week, telling me that the attrition rate was perfectly reasonable and no worse.
It's gone up.
I'd realised it was after a while, but
right.
Anyway. But it's been a great session. Thanks for the audience contributions and to the panellists.